All right, in the last module, we built a module. Basically, we have our session repo module ready to go. And in this module, we're going to start using those modules, just to keep saying the word module over and over again as much as we can. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start by looking at the new keyword that we use to import items from a module into our code. And that's going to be the import keyword. And there's some complexity to it. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about actually being able to use modules. There's some things we need to do in our script tag that are going to allow that to happen. And we'll also look at compatibility, like what browsers allow you to do this and which ones don't. Then we're going to talk about default imports. In the last module, we talked about default exports. Now how do we import those items into our code? And we're going to make our code work again by having a default import out of our session repository. Then we're going to work with named imports. So when we were doing named exports, now we're going to go import those couple other things that we were getting out of our session repository, and we'll pull those things out. Okay, now that we've got this laid out, let's go look at how to turn this thing on. All right, in this first section, what we're going to talk about is actually setting up modules. So in our browser, being able to use modules in our app.js. And the first thing we're going to look at when we're talking about setting things up in the browser is actually looking at browser compatibility for our import statement. And notice Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Opera, Safari, all your web views except for Samsung, they all work. Internet Explorer doesn't work, so you can't do modules in Internet Explorer, but all the rest of these browsers in a fairly up-to-date version are all going to work. So just make sure you've got a browser of this level and you should be ready to go. So if you go into your code in index.html in this app that we've been following along in, if you're just dropping in, that's fine. You don't have to follow along if you don't want to, but if you do, jump back a couple of modules and download our demo code from GitHub and follow along from there. But right here, we have app.js, and we want to convert app.js to be module-based, not just our standard JavaScript style. So what we actually have to do is come in right here and say type equals module. And what that's going to do is turn on modules for this piece and allow us to use the import and export statements inside JavaScript. If we don't have that type equals module there, it doesn't work. Everything kind of falls apart. So this just lets the browser know that that's the type of thing that we're doing. All right, now that we have modules enabled, let's actually start using this thing that we built in this last module by talking about default imports. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into our app.js and we're going to start to change this up to leverage the session repository and template that we built in the last module. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this iffy. We don't need that anymore. We don't want it, and it won't work if we did. So let's format real quick. There we go. Now I need two things. I need get sessions that's going to come from the session repository, and I need session template, which is going to come out of our template. But if you recall from the last module, we are re-exporting session template right here. So everything's going to come out of session repository. But the first thing we're going to do is actually just do this. We're going to import get sessions from session repository.js. Just like that. And what that means, this is what we call a default import. So it doesn't matter what I name this. I could actually just call this import John. And this thing will still work. It doesn't matter what it's called. And that's the reason why it's called a default import, because I don't have to worry about what session repository is. If you go back to session repository, remember we are exporting get sessions as default. And that's what's getting exported, is this get sessions function. But from the app perspective, we don't care what it's called. So let's go back to having it called get sessions, just so we are all on the same page. Now that's a default import. That's all there is to it. And actually, just so we can have this thing up and running, let's go into template. And actually, let's export session template. Let's export session template as default as well. And then we'll just come in here. Now I have both get sessions and session template both being imported. And as long as we get rid of that export, we'll put that back in the next clip. As long as we're there, now our app should work again. Everything should just work and pull in. So let's look at this. If we come back over to our Globomantics website and we go to network, first of all, I want to show you this. It's clear. And I'm going to refresh. And you see template and session repository both are pulled in. Look at this, from app.js lines 1 and 2. And so if we come back over to our code, app.js lines 1 and 2 are where we pull those things from. So that import statement is what's actually going and pulling those two files. If we come back over to our code and go to our console, you'll see no errors and everything works. So that's the default import. We're back up and running and everything works in the default way. Now, there were some other things that weren't default that I might want access to. If we come back over to our session repository, you'll notice I'm also exporting the URL. And actually, I just want to export the session template right here, so I don't need those two things. We don't do that with default imports. We do that with named imports. So let's look for just a minute at what that's going to look like. All right, now that we have default exports working and our application's back up and running, let's look at named imports, which means let's look at some of these other things that we're exporting for our modules and see how to get a hold of those as we pull them in. All right, well, we prepare to put template back together. Let's go over to our template.js. And let's actually not export that as default, because I've got two things. I've got session template and error message. And I want to import maybe both of those things into my app.js. So when we do that, instead of saying import session template, like import default, now we're going to import by name. And basically what that means is I've got to come over here in the same way we export. I just have to import it with the curly braces on either side. And then I can just say import session template and import error message from template. And now these have to be the same. Remember, get sessions didn't have to be the same name as what was coming out of session repository because it's just exporting the default. But in this case, session template and error message have to be the same name as what's coming in. And so I may not want them to be the same name. And so I have the option to come in here and just say, as template. I can totally do that and then just change session template down there to be template. That's totally viable and that totally works. Or I could just leave it like this, however I want to do it. And I'll save. And let's go back to our website. We'll refresh and notice everything still works. So this is how you do named imports. You just import session template and error message. Now I'm importing everything from template, and it seems kind of silly if I have to just kind of list everything out. So I don't actually have to do that. I can say import star as template from template.js. And what that's going to do is take everything that's exported from template.js and drop it into a namespace or an object called template. And then I can take that with a dot and say, hey, template.session template. And now that's going to work. If I come back over to my website and refresh, you'll see everything still works. Excellent. So that's named imports. I can import star. I can import the individual things. But remember here, I was re-exporting in session repository. I was re-exporting session template because I don't want to have to do both things. So if I save that after I got rid of the comment and I come back over here, I can actually just get rid of that and just say, hey, I'm importing get sessions, and then I'm importing also session template. And the rules for this type of import are the same. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying import get session. So import the default. And then in addition to the default, give me all the named stuff. So session repository has coming out of it session URL and session template in addition to the default of get sessions. So here I've got import get sessions, the default, and then session template and session URL coming back out. Now I can do the same thing I was doing before, star as session repository. I'd say session repository.session template. And now I've got my default get sessions and then everything else coming from session repository. So that's named imports, that's default imports, that's hybrid imports where you're importing kind of your default and your named and everything all together. And now what we have is a module called session repository that deals with all of our session stuff. It provides the get sessions method. It provides the template that we're going to render for. It does all the work, and it's bundled and separated away from our index.html code and even our app.js code. App.js can't get to anything that isn't exposed to it from our session repository. So one more time, let's pop over to our app. We'll refresh this and notice now in our network, template.js is coming out of session repository instead of app.js, and session repository is coming out of app.js. So see how those imports have moved around. And when we refresh, everything works. But now instead of having everything baked into our index.html where we have all this gross code sitting in here, now everything's nice and split up and easier to understand and reason about what's going on. All right, that's it. That gets us through this brief course on JavaScript modules. And over the course of this course, we started by talking about what modules are and how they're these little packages of code that we can expose pieces of, but other than that are secure and safe in just being their own bundle. We talked about creating modules with the export keyword. We use export to either export named pieces or export as default to export default pieces of code out to the consuming application. And then we talked about consuming those modules, so being the consuming application, with the import keyword. And it's import the default thing or import and a list of names to import all the pieces out of that module. And with this, basically you have all the information you need to go and start chunking your code up and getting to having small reusable pieces of code bundled together as a module and just exposing the pieces. Now from here, you may want to go and look at something like Webpack, which is going to bundle those modules together and make them a little bit easier to consume holistically instead of having a whole bunch of different files. That would be the next step that you would take from this spot.